Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant development, potentially, in the long conflict in eastern DRC.
That's right. There's talk of a new peace process gaining momentum.
Exactly. The headline is this potential path towards peace with a newly anticipated draft agreement really taking center stage.
And we've been looking at sources discussing some pretty intensive diplomatic efforts lately, haven't we?
We have, and details about this expected draft, it feels like, I don't know, maybe a pivotal moment given how many international players are suddenly involved.
It could be. There's certainly a lot of activity.
So our mission today really is to try and cut through some of the noise, understand what's actually happening, and maybe, what might come next.
We need to look at the timeline, the core issues they're trying to tackle, and maybe temper some of that optimism that seems to be floating around.
Yeah, cautious optimism is definitely the phrase I'm hearing. So the big question, can this latest push finally bring some lasting peace? Let's find out.
It's definitely a moment filled with, well, both hope and, let's be honest, considerable challenges. Understanding the sequence here, the steps, the priorities, that's absolutely key.
Okay, let's dive straight into this draft agreement then. The word out of Washington is, well, we expect a draft peace agreement between Kinshasa, the DRC, and Kigali, Rwanda this Friday, May 2nd.
And it's really important to stress that word, draft.
Right. Crucial point. This isn't the final deal, not by a long shot. It's a draft.
Think of it as the first version, the initial text. It then needs to be reviewed, picked apart, really, by Congolese, Rwandan, and American experts.
Mm-hmm. And this builds on something that happened just last week.
Exactly. It builds on that Declaration of Principles signed the week before. You had the foreign ministers from both countries, plus U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there.
Okay, so that declaration laid the groundwork.
Pretty much. It set the foundation. And this draft is supposed to flesh out the specifics. We're expecting it to cover several really critical areas.
And these areas sound fundamental, things like territorial sovereignty.
Which is huge in this context. Basically, a country's right to control its own affairs without, outside interference. A massive issue here.
Definitely. Then there's combating armed groups, plural.
Yes, the many groups that have caused so much tragedy.
The mineral trade, which is always lurking in the background.
Often murky, yes.
Yeah.
And critical to the conflict economy.
The refugee situation, incredibly sensitive.
Hugely sensitive, impacting millions.
Regional cooperation, trying to get everyone working together.
A perennial challenge.
And even the future role of international forces like MONUSCO, that's quite a list.
There's a significant agenda. And the way they're doing this, the diplomatic process, is kind of interesting.
How so?
Well, the foreign ministers didn't actually have to be physically present for this draft submission. It's all being handled remotely.
Like the declaration signing last week.
Exactly. Amendments, suggestions, feedback. A lot of this back and forth is apparently happening digitally.
Does that work for such sensitive talks? Are there downsides to not being in the same room?
That's a really good question. It's certainly efficient in one way, but you might lose some nuance, perhaps. Something to watch.
So, okay, definitely no big signing ceremony on May 2nd then.
No, not at all. That's not the plan.
So what happens next with this draft?
The timeline we're hearing points to a meeting maybe the third week of May back in Washington. The foreign ministers would attend that one.
Okay. And the goal there?
To hammer out the details, to refine the text, iron out disagreements, and hopefully agree on a consolidated version based on all that remote feedback.
Right. Getting everyone on the same page, literally.
Precisely.
And the actual signing, the main event.
That's still penciled in for June, potentially. Also in the U.S.
And it sounds like it could be quite the production.
Well, the talk is potentially Presidents Tshisekedi and Kagame being there, hosted by President Trump, maybe even other African heads of state attending.
Wow, okay. That level of involvement, especially a U.S. president hosting, that would send a very strong signal, wouldn't it?
It certainly would signal major commitment from the top. But, intentions versus outcomes.
You see. And it's important to remember, this isn't the only game in town, right?
Absolutely not. While Washington focuses on the state-to-state agreement, remember those parallel talks happening in Doha?
Yes, Doha. That involves Kinshasa and the AFC-M23.
Correct. The Alliance Fleuve Congo Coalition, which includes M23. And there are also separate talks, again in Doha, directly between Kinshasa and Kigali.
So multiple tracks. Washington, Doha. It's complex.
Very complex. Different actors, slightly different focuses, all supposedly aiming for peace, but it adds layers.
Which brings us nicely to the wider picture that this intense international diplomatic activity, A strong diplomatic mobilization, as one source put it.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's suddenly paying attention again.
Take Belgium, for instance. Their foreign minister, Maxime Prévost, just did a 5-day trip through the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm. He went to Uganda, Burundi.
But not Rwanda, which is telling.
It certainly highlights the, let's say, currently strained relationship between Brussels and Kigali. There's history there, of course.
What's Belgium's general stance on these peace efforts?
They seem supportive of the Washington and Doha tracks, but with a significant caveat.
Which is?
They're really pushing for the integration of internal Congolese dynamics. They don't want local issues and voices ignored.
Like the national dialogue proposed by the churches.
Exactly that. Prévost specifically mentioned it as something important that needs to be part of the solution, not just top-down agreements.
And Belgium's not alone in this diplomatic flurry. The UK sent their special envoy, Tiffany Sadler.
Yes, aiming to boost British support for stability and prosperity, as the official line goes.
And the European Union has been very active, too. Their special representative, Johan Borgstem, just wrapped up a visit to Kinshasa yesterday, May 1st.
Right. And the EU seems quite firm in its position.
Firm how?
They're not just interested in seeing an agreement signed. They're insisting on concrete implementation of any commitments made. They want to see action, not just words.
They're scrutinizing the draft agreement closely, then.
Very closely, according to our sources. And Borgstem had a quote that really stood out.
What did he say?
He said, "The EU is," and I'm quoting roughly here, "really encouraging the conclusion of a peace agreement that is coordinated with the efforts in course in the region, in the spirit of what is called African solutions for African problems."
African solutions for African problems. That's a familiar phrase, but important in this context.
Absolutely. It underscores the need for regional ownership involving bodies like the EAC and SADC. Borgstem also stressed that all stakeholders need to engage seriously and implement actions quickly.
Within all these different dialogue frameworks we've mentioned.
Yes. And crucially, the EU keeps reiterating the need to respect UN Security Council principles, including, very clearly, the DRC's sovereignty.
That sovereignty point keeps coming up.
As it should. It's fundamental.
We also heard about another meeting in Doha, a follow-up.
That's right. Involving quite a group. DRC, Rwanda, the U.S., Qatar, France, and Togo.
Quite a coalition trying to keep the momentum going.
It shows broad international backing, or at least involvement. And then you had President Trump's comments last weekend.
Yes, the optimist.
Saying there was excellent news to come with Rwanda and the Congo, and adding, "We really hope that this will materialize." High-level public encouragement.
Okay, so lots of diplomatic energy, lots of optimism, maybe cautious optimism.
But also a strong call for vigilance.
Particularly from Belgium, right? Minister Prévost again?
Yes. After his tour, including meetings in Kinshasa with Prime Minister Judith Suminwa and President Tshisekedi, he was quite clear.
What was his main message?
While he acknowledged the efforts in Doha and Washington, he stressed the need for, his word was, prudence.
Prudence, okay.
And the importance of evaluating tangible results in the near future. He wants to make sure this opened path, as he called it, doesn't hit unexpected roadblocks. Basically, let's see some real progress on the ground.
And he made a rather pointed comment about Belgium's own intentions, didn't he? Something about vampirizing resources.
He did. He contrasted Belgium's approach with what he called a more transactional approach from some other international actors.
Saying Brussels doesn't intend to vampirize the DRC's resources, that's strong language.
Very strong. It clearly speaks to the long, troubled history of resource exploitation in the Congo, often linked to external powers and the conflict itself. It's a way of positioning Belgium as a partner without ulterior economic motives, perhaps.
And did he have any other advice for President Tshisekedi?
He encouraged him not to ignore those internal initiatives we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Again, stressing the need for balance between these big international pushes and locally driven solutions. Don't forget the Congolese people in all this.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We're seeing this major diplomatic surge focused on this anticipated draft agreement in Washington.
A concerted push involving many international players, Belgium, UK, EU, Qatar, US, others.
All aiming to facilitate some kind of resolution to this incredibly complex, long-running conflict.
And there's definitely a sense of cautious optimism. You hear it from people like President Trump. You see it in the level of engagement.
But balanced by these calls for vigilance, for prudence, particularly from actors like Belgium, a reminder to watch for tangible results, not just diplomatic statements.
Exactly. This draft agreement, if it comes together, is a potentially significant step. but just one step.
The process is clearly ongoing. More talks are planned for May and a final signing, maybe June. Still lots of ifs.
Precisely. This moment holds potential, no doubt.
Mhm.
But the deep roots of this conflict, the history, the complexities, nothing is guaranteed here.
Which leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. In a region with such a long, painful history of conflict, and now with all these external actors involved, what do you think is the single biggest hurdle, the main obstacle that needs to be overcome for any agreement like this potential one to actually stick and bring real, lasting peace to Eastern DRC?
It's a tough question. Is it trust? Is it dealing with the armed groups? Is it resource management? Or something else entirely?
Something definitely worth pondering as this story continues to unfold. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.